Good morning to everybody joining us today. Indeed, just echoing what Lewis said about this being a timely discussion, of course, a lot of moving furniture, I would say, a lot of moving pieces. And in this first panel, what we want to try and do is focus specifically on the question of defense production in Europe, which, of course, has a capability dimension, but also primarily has a industrial dimension, and also there are questions in about financing the preparedness of member states, etc., to be industrially prepared for the geopolitical context which we're facing. So it's very nice to be able to pull together a panel of excellent speakers, and I'm very happy to moderate this session. Before we get going on the introductions and the overarching context of the panel, let me just remind our viewers that we're not today operating under the Chatham House rule, right? So you're free to use what you hear and to put it to names as well. As I've already mentioned, in this panel, what we want to try and do is not only just unpack some of the recent developments in the European defense industrial landscape and policy, but also to try and understand some of the repercussions of some of the geopolitical dynamics and how they're animating industrial questions. I think a lot of us who are here today for this event are probably familiar with a lot of the steps that the European Union in particular are taking. Next week, we are eagerly anticipating the white paper on defense, which will be published, I believe, on the 19th of March. And also, as we've seen in the last few days and weeks, we've also seen the Rearm Europe plan, which for those keen observers of us would also have noted yesterday in the Oval Office meeting between President Trump and Secretary General Rutte that it actually got name-checked as well. So 800 billion was mentioned in the total there. Independently of the European Union, I think also in London, we've seen the London Summit, which has also raised questions about the defense industrial preparedness of Europe. And to be extremely timely, only a few hours ago even, news coming from Berlin as well on the question of investment for infrastructure and defense as well, which of course marks quite a change, I think, also in the German approach to these questions. So we have a lot of, I would say, points on the table to discuss. Before we jump into the content, let me briefly introduce our four excellent speakers. First of all, Alexandr Burilkov. Hello, Alexandr. You're the Assistant Director for Research at the GLOBSEC GeoTech Center. Thanks for being with us. Should also be noted that Alexandr has also recently co-authored a number of interesting papers on this specific question of defense industrial cooperation. Second on my list is Sylvia Kainz-Huber, who's the Deputy Director and Head of Unit for Defense Industry in the European Commission. A big thank you to Sylvia for jumping in at the last moment to replace François Arbeau. But it's very good, of course, to have DG DEFIS represented here today, especially given how DG DEFIS and the Commission are increasingly playing a critical role in defense questions. Third on my list is Jan P. So we have the industry voice here, Secretary General of the Aerospace, Security and Defense Industries Association of Europe, or as they're normally known, ASD Europe. Thanks for being with us, Jan. Very good to also have the industry voice with us. And then last but certainly not least, Fenella McGerty, who's a Senior Fellow for Defense Economics at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So I think we have four excellent speakers with different perspectives to walk us through our debate today. And let's get started on that. And first, let me maybe turn to Alexandr, if I can come to you first. I think very interestingly, you recently wrote about how Europe can defend itself without the United States, which is one of the burning questions, I think, facing many, many Europeans. And in your paper, you argued that at least 250 billion euros would be needed to deter Russian aggression. I guess to kick our debate off and to also link it to the geopolitical discussions that we're having, or geopolitical drivers that we can see in defense industrial policy, I wonder if you could kick us off by giving us your views on how you see Russia's defense sector actually shaping up, right? So not the European Union's or NATO's, but Russia. So Russia being one of the major threats, of course. So how is Russia's defense sector shaping up? And what do you think are the consequences for Europe's own defense industrial revitalization in that context? So keeping the two together, if we can put it that way. Alexandr, I'm going to hand over the floor to you and looking very much forward to your views.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And let me just get in it as quickly as possible. As Daniel mentioned, last September, with some colleagues, we looked into this question in the context of German rearmament. We are continuing to look into this question, as it is, of course, an ongoing issue. And what we observe with the Russian defense sector is twofold. The first one is that by now it should be clear that the Russian military that invaded Ukraine in October on February 24, 2022, no longer exists. What we have in its place is a learning organization, as described by General Cavoli, that is larger, more experienced, and better equipped than that army of February 24th. And that is a big part of the ongoing challenge in how do we turn these plans, these promises, these 800 billion at the EU level, these however many hundreds of billions at the German level, other investments elsewhere, how do we turn that into meaningful capabilities for one very specific goal? And that goal should be deterring the Russian Federation. And most critically, and I refer back to the lessons of those opening weeks of the war in Ukraine, what we saw there was the two largest land armies in Europe, Ukraine and Russia, face off against each other. And it was only the size and resilience of the Ukrainian military in land warfare that enabled it to first withstand the assault and then turn back the tide. And this is exactly where we should be drawing our lessons from, because the Russian Federation is a land power, first and foremost. Second, and this is something also I'll discuss, it is a missile power, which is very relevant for what we do. But any Russian military action of a large-scale nature will, by definition, be a land action. And this conditions the set of targets. We, of course, everyone knows about the Suwalki Gap and Baltic scenarios and so on. That's good 10 country, sad to say. And it also conditions the way that the Russians have thought about and developed production in the last 3 years. Pure conflict of the sort that we see in Ukraine is extremely demanding on everyone involved. Casualties are high. This is inevitable. Attrition and losses in personnel and equipment are high. This is also something that we're going to have to get used to when we make our planning. The days of expeditionary warfare like Afghanistan, these are gone. And of course, Russian industry has had to cope with that and with a related sets of challenges where to get and supply intermediaries, how to circumvent sanctions. Of course, we know all about that. But at its core, the Russian defense industry today was able to rely on a unique asset that Ukraine also relied on, and that is the legacy of the Soviet Union. Massive state-owned factories of a scale that is difficult to comprehend when compared to what we have in Europe. And when we crunched the numbers last September, we came up with some disturbing data. More than 1,500 tanks a year, thousands of armored vehicles of all kinds, hundreds of pieces of artillery, over 10,000 missiles fired in 3 years of conflict. That is an arsenal far deeper than Europe collectively. And the question that goes forward, of course, is a large part of that has come by refurbishing Soviet stocks. We know that the Soviets left a lot behind. Whenever these stocks run out, I've heard estimates of 2026, I've also heard 2027, production will decrease. But we need to be aware of two very relevant developments to that. The first one is that we are looking at an environment that is shaping up to be a post-hostility environment by those dates. That means that attrition will no longer be a factor in Russian rearmament. Fully 55% at least of everything the Russians produce every year now in the conflict is destroyed on the battlefield. That will no longer be the case. The second is that we observe that when the Russians produce new systems, so not refurbishing something that was left behind, but something entirely new, which is a minority, as I mentioned, they will produce the top edge of their systems. They will produce T-90 MS tanks. They will produce Malva artillery pieces. They will produce KH-101 and Kinzhal missiles. These are capable systems. Some of these systems are as capable as anything in the European inventory, both current and in the near future. So we need to be aware that a post-conflict Russia, strictly from the military perspective, will be a military that will enjoy the advantages of having grown significantly, of having hundreds of thousands of experienced fighters, which is an asset that no amount of money can buy, and of having a pipeline to modern battle-tested weaponry. And this is the state of the Russian defense industrial base. And of course, when we look at external suppliers, which is going to be my closing remark, China has been a constant presence there. The Chinese strategy vis-a-vis the conflict has always been ambiguous. They have sought to prevent the Russian loss, which is not the same as ensuring a Russian victory, of course. But China has never joined in the sanctions, and it will not join in any sanctions, especially not in a post-hostilities environment. So that pipeline, which by the way goes both ways, Chinese intermediate products for Russian military expertise and know-how, it will continue. And that's a fact that we need to be aware of when we think about how do we need to rearm for the future and for addressing the Russian threat. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexandra, for getting us started and for the cold bucket of water over our heads, I guess, for the beginning of our conversation. I think it was excellent what you said about giving us indication of what to expect, not only now, but also more importantly in the post-conflict environment. And I think you also pointed to the not only just the importance of the experience of the Russian forces, but also for us to have a better appreciation of some of the productive power and productive capacity that Russia can rely on as well, and also to flag, and maybe Fenella may also mention that a bit later, but also the amount of investment that's being pumped in as well from the Russian side. And so there's a question there also of the capacity of the Russian federal budget to invest in defense compared to what Europeans are prepared to invest in the military dimension. But thanks so much, Alexandra, for kickstarting us. And I guess that leads us nicely to you, Jan, with that kind of reality check, as it were, and keeping in mind that, of course, it's probably natural to think that, you know, Europe's defense industry looks favorably on increased defense spending. But it seems to me now that we've also progressed beyond this discussion of just the spending almost, and looking more at the quality of that spending. And we have, you know, the Commissioner for Defense also speaking about the so-called Big Bang moment in European defense, whenever that will come. But when it does come, and if it does come, what to do in concrete terms following that with that increased investment. So from your perspective, I'd be very interested to know, firstly, what does Europe's defense industry need actually to ensure ramping up and the sustained ramping up of production, especially given what Alexandra said about what to expect from the Russian side? The floor is yours, Jan.
So thank you very much, Daniel, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think when one speaks, and I was very interested in listening also to the previous speaker here on the description of Russia, and I think it's a totally different set of defense industry that we have in Europe related to that. And I think this is maybe the starting remark that I like to make, is that when you think about the defense industry in Europe, I question myself what that really is. I think what we often talk about is what we see the tip of the iceberg. We speak about the OEMs, we speak about the brands we know, we speak about Thales, Dassault, Leonardo, you name it. But I don't know to what extent we fully realize that at ASD, if I take the organization that I represent, we claim to represent some 4,000 companies across Europe. But if you look into the number of sub-suppliers that these companies are dependent on, we speak about more than 100,000 sub-suppliers. And these are not purely defense companies. These are companies that are dual, or that are commercial companies that supply to the defense. So when you look at the tip of the iceberg, this is where you say we need the ramp up, but what lies behind that ramp up is a full ecosystem ramp up of the supply chain that goes to mid caps, that goes to SMEs, and in that perspective, roughly around 70% or so of the turnover of the OEMs are flowing down the supply chain, and you can chop that into two big blocks, and you can say 40% would be at mid caps and 30% would end up with SMEs. So It is a massive ramp up of an entire ecosystem that we talk about, rather than just the known brands, if I may say so. Now, can we do that ramp up, and what is needed? I think that what we've seen so far, obviously, since it's a complex ecosystem, it will be different depending on which company you talk to, where they are in the ecosystem, etc. You will get a multiple number of different pictures of what they are. I think two comments on my side. One is that part of our ecosystem has already shown a very impressive capability of ramping up. We are already, when it comes to, for example, 155 millimeters ammunition, we are producing at factor 15 in 2027 versus what we did in 2022. We are producing, when it comes to certain air defense missiles, something like a factor 6 of what we did in 2022. And you see, also from an employment perspective, example, Saab as an example has a net increase in terms of their employees of 6,300 over 3 years only, and now the Saab CEO is saying that the 2025 and 2026 you will see another net increase of 2,000 more people. MBDA has invested 2.5 billion in of their own money in production capacities, facilities, tools, etc., etc., and that has led to a factor 4 increase of what they are, generally speaking, what they are doing. So on the one hand side, you can see that there is a massive ramp up that's already ongoing. At the same time, you can see that part of our ecosystem is not even challenged to the maximum of its production. And I think this is a very interesting as a reflection, because we speak about Europe that should be maybe deterrence is the key objective number one, but if worse comes to worse, obviously we should be able to fully go to war as well if needed. And if we should be able to go to war, I find it a bit contradicting that part of the ecosystem is not even challenged to its maximum capacity as we speak. A good example of that, I think, is the A400M, which is a strategic airlift capability that we're all, I guess, very well aware of, and where I think the overall number of aircraft that were ordered when the 10 nations came together were 178. Roughly three quarters of that has been delivered. There's 1 quarter that is still missing, and it will take another 4 years or so to deliver that quarter. And after that 4 years, after that, if there is no more orders, then you have an assembly line, a production line, a sub-suppliers community of many, many tens of thousands of sub-suppliers that will simply be dismantled. And if Europe at that stage would go to war, and then a couple of those A400Ms are shot down, and you realize, first of all, maybe you need more aircraft simply because of actually being active, and maybe you need to replace number that are actually lost in war as well. You come in with a new order of 20 aircraft or so. If you do that, in 5 or 6 years from now, the risk is that there is no production capacity whatsoever. So some of our companies are de facto challenged to keep production going without orders or without very few new orders. So painting the picture on both sides, to a certain extent, we are producing and ramping up production massively. On the other hand, we're not even challenged. Now, would the rest of the ecosystem be challenged? Because this is what industry would want to, obviously. Industry would really, this is what my CEOs tell me when we are in the board discussions. They'd love to be challenged to the maximum capacity. What is needed to get there? Of course, the key element still is the substantial long-term orders. They are still missing. When we speak about things like, for example, battle tanks, the only orders we've seen for battle tanks are the orders for replacing those that have been sent to Ukraine. We haven't seen any ramp up of the stocks in the different member states. We haven't seen any real serious come together attempts and build a European platform. But this is also what we would want to see. If you want a quick ramp up on the European defense industrial base, then you need to ensure that you put in place large scale orders. Then you need to come forward with the pooling on the demand side, with the harmonization of the military requirements, and you need to move from policy statements to actions. And this is not yet happening. Should that happen, when I say it's not yet happening, it's not yet happening at high speed. I mean, things are starting to move as we speak, but still there are many, many orders that we think should be placed yesterday rather than wait another year or two for them. And should that happen, of course, the challenges that industry would face based on what I just described before is one is the ramp up of the supply chain. There will certainly be challenges with finding proper skills. But there will also be challenges in terms of access to finance and these kind of issues that are not yet a memory of the past. It is still very much existing. And I spoke the other day, a week ago or so, to one of my members who is a dual company active on the defense side as well as on the commercial side. And the interesting, very, very interesting experience they had, and very frightening experience. When they are being asked to ramp up on the defense side, they have many of their suppliers on the commercial side that have the components or materials or whatever they are asking for that could step in on the defense side, but they are afraid to do so. They don't dare, so they say, no, thank you. I don't want to deal with the defense side because I'm afraid I will lose my relationship with the bank or I will lose my insurance, etc. So that's still happening as we speak. So indeed, there would be challenges on skills. There would be challenges on beefing up the entire supply chain, but there would be challenges on access to finance and these kind of things as well. But I consider those as, you know, the lower level of challenges. The main challenge is the long-term visibility, the pooling on the demand side, place those orders now, and it can't be orders that keeps asking industry to do an investment, but you only look 1 or 2 years ahead. You need to look rather long so that you can handle the risks, the financial risks that you'd be taking. Should that happen, I mean, a key element of that, which I think it would be maybe the last thing that I'd like to stress here at the beginning of this panel, is that if you want a strong European defense industrial base, of course, then you need to invest in European equipment. And this is also still not happening to the extent that we would like to see.
Thanks so much, Jan. Actually, I mean, you did a kind of customarily rich and comprehensive viewpoint of where industry stands today. But linking it back to Alexander's opening remarks, I feel even more worried today because what you said about the direct suppliers and the subcontractors, it's actually a vast supply chain of companies and producers. And what you said, especially about or linking the idea of ramping up production with this overarching idea of a war economy, and that has actually been mentioned by a few politicians actually in public speeches, that there still seems to be a huge mismatch between existing capacity, what we might need in the future if things really deteriorate, and the industry's ability to respond to those political demands. So I'm not sure I will sleep any better tonight, but at least I have a clearer understanding of what some of the needs are, and I thank you for that, Jan. And also, and we might come back to that in the Q&A actually, but I think some of the points that you mentioned about developing capacity, so the relationship between what capacity we currently have and what we might need in the future. And you also put your finger on 2 other components which are really vital, the skills dimension and then the finance access. And I think Fenella will also chime in on that point a bit later as well. Before we move to Sylvia, I just wanted to tell everyone listening and also to our panelists that the Q&As will come in the Q&A box. So you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. So those who already want to look can. I'll be coming back to these questions at the end of our at the end of all of the presentations, and then you can pick and choose which ones you see best. There's already one on governance of defense, which we can get to a bit later. So thanks for that, and also again, once again, thanks to Jan as well for that overview. Sylvia, I'd like to turn to you now, if possible, for the European Commission's perspective. I mean, I said right at the beginning that I think there's no doubt now that the European Commission is a fully fledged actor in defense, not just because of DEFIS or the Commissioner, but I think also in what Jan was saying about moving from the words to the action side of things. So actually putting money on the table and trying to develop a number of important initiatives. I guess we will all have to wait very patiently for the white paper next week, not to put more expectations on that paper. But I guess what will be mentioned in that paper are some of the core initiatives that the Commission is proposing and the Union is proposing, which you can walk us through. And just to flag them very briefly. I think the first one is the Rearm Europe plan that emerged very quickly, I would say, after some of the language and ideas that were coming out of the White House, and also in response, I guess, to the broader question of peace in Ukraine and some of those major questions, the 800 billion that was announced within the Rearm Europe plan. And then beyond that, I think also looking at some of the existing initiatives, such as the European Defence Industry Programme, which is on the table, and also some of the sensitive discussions that will come on the horizon very quickly for the next multi-annual financial framework and the money that will be available for defense there. But I want from you, Sylvia, if possible, first of all, a kind of summation of what you've seen over the last few weeks and months from the European Commission on Defense, also with a greater demand from the Council, the European Council, asking for that role, and also to maybe unpack a bit the Rearm Europe plan. And more generally, how do you see the European Commission seeking to support defense production in Europe, given what both Alexandr and Jan have already said? So Sylvia, I give you the floor, and thanks again for joining us last minute.
Yes, good afternoon, Daniel. Thanks for giving me the floor and also for inviting me and accepting me, replacing Francois here at the very last minute. So I'm reacting a little bit to what I have heard now. I think the Commission's role and what we could do on our side is actually some of the issues which Jan has mentioned, which is now, okay, there is the industry on the one side, there is a need to mobilize, aggregate demand. I think here the Commission has already shown, maybe through urgency programs, but very short term, that there is things we can do and how we can help aggregating on pushing that demand. Also, not only that it will be done in a joint form, so that there is no crowding out also of the demands and the needs of notably smaller member states. I think the money mobilizing, that is also something here which most recently now with the Rearm initiative and plan, which Commission President von der Leyen has now most recently announced, where there is also what we have learned also over the past years, that from the programs when we were trying to launch them, which is really the most important one, seeing how these investments can be unlocked and what we can do at national level to support that. And I think a third area where we can really intervene, which is also part of that Rearm plan and what we're going to also announce in the white paper next week, is really looking also in our national, in our legislative framework, what we can do. What we learned, for example, from ASAP is it's not only looking at the supply chains, supporting ramping up efforts from industry, but that there is a lot more what could be simplified, notably also in the production capacity of industry. That starts with administrative procedure that are really simplifications, things in the overarching framework, a legislative framework we could look at. And then fourth, but that's a bit longer term, and we're already doing that. That's the R&D component. Maybe I can come a little bit later on that one as well. Now, you asked me a bit to give you an overview roughly, but recall a little bit what are the key elements now of that Rearm Europe plan, which Commission President von der Leyen just put forward last week. That consists, yes, first of all, money of the new financial EU instrument, which she proposed and put forward, and which was really widely supported also by the European Council on 6 March. That's this instrument based on Article 122, which really would then allow to provide loans at the level of 150 billion to member states for them to support achieving a more rapid and significant increase in investment in defense capabilities. So we would provide loans that member states can then use for investing in defense capabilities. what we would like to see, obviously, here is that this is then used for actually really doing common procurement, and ideally, of course, then also procurement on sourcing from ideally European industry where you can and where the capabilities needed are then really also available. It will also offer an opportunity for Ukraine, which is invited to join member states and place contracts with the EU and with EU member states and with EU industry and Ukrainian industry. And then the second element, this is this famous escape clause from the Stability and Growth Pact, where then up to 1.5% of GDP can be for each member state can be excluded or up to 1.5% of GDP of expenditure used for defense equipment, defense equipment, and in defense matters can be excluded from the state debts. Then we wanted to look, a third element is really then looking into other possibilities and incentives we can give to member states. For example, and in particularly in the cohesion policy programs, where again, by eliminating a lot of restrictions, hurdles, using the financial incentives that are available, which is also we would like to unlock for allowing and supporting and increasing member states' investment capacity in defense in that domain. And then very roughly, the fourth and the fifth big element, that's really now about mobilizing private capital by accelerating the savings and investment union, also through the investment bank, where we're already for quite a while and continuously trying to do what also Jan has mentioned, which is ensuring that defense companies, not only on the basis of activities they do with a dual use capacity or dual use potential, but really on the pure fact that they are also producing or are active in the defense domain, will not be hampered by getting access to funding so in short, trying to influence the EIB to change its funding policy. And that's an ongoing activity, so that's not new, that's not how we started. We do that already and push on that side for several years now. And of course, we hope that the situation as it is now will create a lot more awareness on that side that things need to be changed at that end. And now the white paper, you asked about that as well, to come next week. What will it do? Without going into detail, it will basically explain in more detail how we will implement or propose to implement that rearm plan, how to spend these additional resources which we want to mobilize in the most efficient way. And here again, I'm coming back to the idea to say, as we have done it already with EDIRPA, the EDIRPA program, to incentivize and to motivate member states to say, please do it, procure jointly where you can, where it makes sense. This creates economies of scale. This ensures that there is no crowding out of smaller demands and from smaller member states, which would be detrimental. And if that money now again is not spent as so many, the majority of investments made, additional investments made by member states over the past month in using EU industry resources and sources where you can and where the equipment which you need is really can be made available or is available, then we would really consider that as a massively missed chance and possibility. And then, yes, the third area we want to look at also in this white paper is now how to achieve defense readiness. And here I'm also coming back and absolutely agree with what Jan said. it cannot be one shots. This needs to be done in a more lasting, I would almost say sustainable way. That is indeed for industry one of the key matters. It doesn't help us if we have no visibility over what demand will be and how demand will evolve over time. So let me stop here. So that's a bit the plan of what's to come, and yes, details to be then set out in the white paper next week.
Thanks so much, Sylvia, for that overview, and also for, I think, also touching upon some of the questions which I also have in mind, which we'll come to in the Q&A session. I would also in the Q&A session like to invite you to also touch on the R&D dimension, because of course today we are talking about production, we're talking about common procurement capabilities, etc. But there is the innovation and R&D side, which I'm not saying it's being neglected, but there is a risk that it's overlooked for pressing needs. So we'll come back to that, and thanks for giving us a little taster for the white paper. I'm sure we're all going to be buried in that on Wednesday when it's emerged, for those who have not seen it already, of course. Thanks for that. And Fenella, I want to come to you if possible now. I think already a few things have been said about access to finance in particular, and it was quite striking, I think, looking at your recent military balance, the annual military balance that IISS produces, and looking through some of the data in the balance. It probably wasn't surprising to me to learn that we've seen like what is it, 11.7% increase in defense investments or spending for last year, for 2024. So there's clearly a lot more money going into defense, but still we have these questions about access to private finance. Where can we find new sources of money? I think even Sylvia mentioned in the context of Rearm Europe, the idea is partly to rely on loans, for example, but more and more we're thinking about, private capital, venture capital, etc. So I'm wondering if you can help us maybe, first of all, understand some of the dynamics of private finance and finance more generally, and how do you think that can influence or interplay with European defense production efforts? Thanks, Fenella.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I found the talk so far so interesting. I was nodding along to a lot of it. I'm sure it could be seen, but so thank you. And I think we've touched on, as you say, a few of the themes that I was going to take us through on the financial side, but if you bear with me, I'll try to address the three aspects on the financing and industry side. So Daniel, as you mentioned there, the growth so far has been really quite impressive at the top level. As you mentioned, the 11.7% growth in real terms last year, and that was an acceleration from 5.2% growth in 2023, and that was up from 2.8% in 2022. So we saw an acceleration of growth in the region, reflecting those aims to bolster investment in defence, also meet that 2024 deadline of 2% of GDP. But so the pace of increase has been impressive so far. But that does have to be considered alongside the fact that it was achieved through a variety of mechanisms. So off-budget defence funds, inclusion of military aid to Ukraine, in some cases redefining elements of spending to fall under the umbrella of defence. So in some cases, it perhaps wasn't necessarily an increase for the core defence budget, aligned with long-term planning, allocations to different programmes and different elements of spending to give that security to industry, as Jan was saying. Yes, we saw capability funds for acquisitions, but because of that pace that this reorientation is happening at, it's not necessarily that all that money is going to European companies. Obviously, the example of Poland using South Korea's material for main battle tanks, artillery and light fighters. That deal included technology transfer, local production, but when you speak with kind of Polish counterparts, it would seem that the main driver was the speed, the flexibility of contracting. So even when funding does increase for programs, because it's not building into long-term plans yet, I mean, countries vary. There are gold star countries, and then there are countries that that really need to do more. But it's that ability to enable European industry to invest with more confidence and take on more risk. The second theme is really looking at future growth. So what industry can expect to happen. So Europe often usually decides or proposes the next year's budget in the autumn. So we did have an idea of what spending was going to be in 2025. A few countries in the region were still planning that uptick. The pace of growth was still quite high, primarily among the Nordic countries. But overall regional growth was actually a bit more muted. It was set to go back to around 5%. Countries were kind of moving to sustain spending at new higher levels and then also address quite urgent fiscal sort of spending needs elsewhere. So because defence had so much investment over the last 2 to 3 years, it was moving to a sustainment phase. Obviously, everything shifted and concerns have mounted regarding the reliability of the US as a strategic ally. So we've now seen several other countries announce uplifts for defence, even in the last few weeks. UK, Belgium, Denmark, Germany's major or potential proposed initiatives to bolster funding for defence, and the major initiatives at the EU level, as Sylvia has taken us through so well, so I won't go into those now. But in terms of what countries are doing, I think concerns over the affordability of further increases are really significant. So given that countries might now move to extend deficits and debt further to fund defence, obviously necessary, and providing that headroom will enable countries to make those increases. But arguably countries need to do this carefully because we're already at quite a high debt level among several countries across the EU, and the IMF was actually presenting quite significant concerns in terms of Europe's economic recovery on the fiscal side, where if you combine increased defence spending with costs for climate change mitigation or aligned with associated with demographic shifts, that was going to increase to ever-increasing proportions of GDP over the next 2 decades. And it was an even greater burden for countries, sort of emerging regional economies as well. So that, given that those estimates and that concern was given back in October last year, as countries moved to further finance increases in defence, I think those concerns will become more acute for the IMF. So I think countries are examining what options they do have to enable further increases beyond increasing deficit and debt levels. So there's going to be a mix of policy measures and funding instruments, potentially looking at increased taxation or cuts to other areas of public spending, as the UK did with the recent budget increase announcement, where overseas development aid was cut in order to bolster defence by 2027. And again, there's also the mobilisation of the potential of private sector financing. So I think it will probably be a combination of all, as we can see in the ReArm programme. But I think still there's the uncertainty for industry at the country level, for all that governments are seeking to reassure them about without that secure financial backing, long-term plans, and as Jan was saying, the long-term production contracts not actually coming through yet. Most of the industry will still need to operate with caution. We've seen some companies being able to use their own money or external financing to fund production expansion. Others are still waiting for production contracts. So the speed with which those production contracts have arrived varies by country and actually varies by sector as well. Investment in land systems, as you might expect, so armoured vehicles, artillery, air defence, is being prioritised, so that's being sped up. But the other sectors aren't necessarily seeing the speed of production contracts come through. Companies have reduced their capacity over recent decades as well to meet that reduced demand, because we came into this in a period of kind of underinvestment in defence. So industry is starting from a low production point. And I think that, again, we've seen European defence primes benefit. We've seen rocketing share prices of Rheinmetall, Saab, Leonardo, BAE. But smaller countries in the defence industrial base can find it hard to benefit from the increased financing because of the nature of procurement schemes or the financing programs themselves. So the final aspect to touch on there is looking at the private financing aspect. I think the role that it plays in easing some of the pressure is being increasingly considered. And some of the argument is that the potential levels of investment are seemingly much lower when you compare it to public spending on defence. But given that this funding is largely for encouraging startups and SMEs to enter the defence market or even re-enter it if they've had to leave it in the past because of the underinvestment. This is funding to foster innovation, to foster R&D, industrial collaboration, so to help European defence industrial resilience as well. So if you compare it, say, to European defence R&D budgets, the financing available is far more comparable. The adherence to application of environment, social and governance standards can mean that private financing for R&D and investment in production capacity is quite difficult to secure for many entities within the industry. I think there has been huge progress in this even over the last year. The messaging at the public level, government and EU and NATO level has really shifted and become far more clear and assertive in terms of that defence can be viewed through that it promotes stability and sustainability across Europe. That security enables the ongoing sustainability within the region. So without a good investment in defence, then you risk undermining anything through economic security and stability going forward. I think beyond the adjustment to the EU fiscal rules, the other initiatives within the ReArm programme that looks at mobilising private capital are really kind of key, and they're the latest in a series of statements at these national EU and NATO level. And I think we did see back in December, Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, also imploring at the citizen level. So it's actually getting down to not just industry, but actually the individual within society to actually feed back to banks, to pension funds, that it's okay to invest in defence, to not exclude it from their portfolios, to actually find those kind of increases and opportunities where they might have precluded defence before. So I think governments in the EU and the UK are really trying to determine what they can do to normalise that investment in defence. And it's all about creating those conditions, as Sylvia was talking about, where we can have these additional funding streams to assist in reindustrialisation. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thanks so much, Fenella. That was really great, and thanks for focusing on the intricacies of private finance and some of the virtues of that as well. And I also particularly liked how towards the end you linked the question of investment to some of the broader discussions about competitiveness and economic security, which you also mentioned. And you began as well by outlining some of the challenges involved in the spending more equation, right? So it's not just a question of spending more, but there will be tough political choices to be made about spending more generally. So thanks for rounding us off, Fenella, in this panel session, and we move to the Q&A session if we can for the next 28 minutes or so, as I have it on my timing. And we have 2 questions, and I also have a whole host of questions myself. But maybe I think the second question that's also mentioned in the Q&A about where Europe can procure strategic enablers on missile defense and also ISR, I think is quite a critical question for our discussion, and links to a question that I have, which is, firstly, we are talking now in a context where there is a suspicion that maybe key US capabilities that have been supplied for European defense might not be there. So the question of capability gaps that might exist and our ability as Europeans to fill those capability gaps. So who is to replace some of these capability gaps? And I think 2 of them have been mentioned here, missile defense and ISR. So the question is, can we develop these types of common projects at that very level to replace what we might miss from the US side? We also have a question as well from the Q&A session, more on about the governance of EU defence, and particularly looking at the European Commission there and its increasing role in European defence. I think the phrase creeping power has been used, but there are other ways of framing it, of course, in terms of how does the Commission see itself within this landscape now, where it's become a much more important actor. We also have a third question as well, more specifically to ReArm EU as well, whether or not there's a room there to support production and implementation of some of the EDF projects that have been concluded, which may, Sylvia, also relate back to the R&D question of bringing R&D forward through to production. Maybe also let me throw in a few more points, hopefully not too sensitive, but I think they do deserve a question or an answer, maybe. The first one is linked to this question of capacity, right? I think everyone was looking at the headlines recently when it was announced that Rheinmetall are going to look around for former VW plants to try and produce more demand. I mean, that raises a serious question about what capacity or production facilities do we currently have in Europe, and how far is that part of the equation of will we have to build more, where will we build them, etc., etc. I think there's also a point linked to the Ukraine war and the status of the Ukraine war. I guess a few of us are also reflecting on the fact that if there is a peace deal, whatever that looks like in Ukraine, that may actually inadvertently give some governments maybe pause for thought on how much money they want to invest. And coming to what Fenella said as well about the combined questions of threat perception and also available funds that you have to dedicate to defense, etc. And then one final point is on the buy European discussion. I mean, I guess a lot of you are also following the news about whether or not certain member states will rip up, to use the word rip up, contracts on, say, F-35 or other American equipment. But where do we stand really on this question of a European preference? How realistic is it? Where do we see that going? Let me come back. I normally go in reverse order, but I know that's unfair. So maybe what I'll do is just, if you wave at me, I'll give you the opportunity to jump in on a first come, first served basis. Maybe Alexander, because you said you might have to leave quite soon. Maybe I'll give the floor to you first to get the conversation started.
Okay, so just looking a little bit at the Q&A, I will try to look at places where I can actually contribute meaningfully, as it say, because I see a question on Turkey, which I think is a very interesting question, in the sense that in this discussion of rearming Europe, what to do if the US disengages from NATO, which seems not only inevitable, but likely due to developments in the Indo-Pacific. Certainly Turkey, which is the second largest military in NATO and fairly experienced on its own in contemporary warfare, it has some interesting potential as a partner, including its arms industry. That is certainly a factor. It has contributed meaningfully in the opening stages of the Ukraine war, not much so now that the Russians have learned how to deal with some of the Turkish systems like the Bayraktars, but it is definitely a place where there is some potential. As for the question on balance between spending and legacy systems, that I think I will take this one simply because we talk about so much in our piece with Guntram about building these large numbers of land systems. I think it's worth remembering that much of the hardware on both sides here, both we in Europe and also the Red Team, is just upgrades bolted onto late Cold War systems. So there is still very much a space for proven systems where we have the production lines, where we can scale up the production lines quickly, where we can get these weapons out as fast as possible. As I mentioned before, the attrition rate in modern conflict is atrocious, and sometimes simpler systems that are cheaper, that can be built quicker, are more valuable. They're over-engineered vehicles where, as I believe Jan pointed out, you lose a few A400Ms, as wonderful as they are, you cannot replace them. Meanwhile, the Russians still rely on their old Ilyushins. They're much cheaper and they do get the job done. So it is of course, important to stay at the cutting edge of technology. If we don't do that, we will end up like unfortunate examples such as the last Nagorno-Karabakh war, or if you want an even more extreme example, the 1991 Gulf War. We don't want to be the Iraqis in that scenario. But we do also need to have mass when it comes to rebuilding our military forces. Mass is really critical because mass means military resilience. It means you don't crumble after first contact. So I think that's what I'll end my remarks.
Yeah, fantastic, Alexander. Jan, I have you next, and then Sylvia.
So, thank you, Daniel. I'd like to come back to a couple of points mentioned here in different order. I think, first of all, coming back to my initial statement about what the ecosystem actually looks like, I think in order to have a competitive European defense industry as a whole, you need to have a competitive industry base in Europe as a whole. This all starts, defense is just one part, a cutting edge part, interface towards a certain customer, but you need really a cutting edge industrial base. And if you look into the level of research in all these new technology areas, we will speak about artificial intelligence, cloud, big data, quantum computing, 5G, etc. Europe is lagging behind in terms of investments as compared to US and as compared to China, especially, and depending on which area you look into. So I think we have, in general, I think we do have a concern about the long-term competitiveness of the European defense industry. And I think what we need to keep focused upon right now is that already before the war started, there were major concerns on the European industry side about European competitiveness in the long run due to demographic changes, to the shift of financial power from the West to the rest, etc. Because well, we say we're successful on the global scale and competitive on the global scale today, but this is all based on investments in the past. And as we haven't had big programs, we haven't invested in research, etc., we will not stay competitive in the future with these kind of investments that are being made in other parts of the world. So I think when we deal with the war here and now, we need to deal with a scenario that is maybe, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I have no clue when this will come to an end. But in a post-war scenario, you still have these overarching mega trends about demographics, about financing power in the world, etc., where Europe needs to defend its place at the top of the value chain. So message number one, we need to invest massively more in R&D than we're doing. Message number two, I think, comes back to what is embedded here in part of the questions that you raised here about the relationship with the US. And I think here, it's obviously it's a super sensitive topic, but it's also very clear, I think, in terms of numbers. You look at European products and you look at the US products, many of those products would have subcomponents or materials coming from the other one. So first of all, are all the numbers correctly showing where really the product is coming from at the beginning? This can be questioned, but what is a major concern, I think, is obviously when you end up under the ITAR regulation, because you have two where I see two big strategic issues to think about here. One is that, okay, if you're under the ITAR regulation, you might be stopped in your exports, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing is you might also be stopped in operational use of the product. And this means that the power to actually defend, if Europe remains dependent on US technologies, then we are dependent on US decision making. This is clear, and it's that linkage that I'd like to underline. And here I think that when we speak about the future, I do believe that the European defense industrial base will have a quick acceleration if you start placing the orders. Will there be challenges, difficulties? Yes, indeed. There's no doubt about that. But I believe that within you will see an increased rate also on bigger products on platforms that will be very impressive, and you will see within 5 years you'll have a totally different defense industrial base than you have today. And to me the question is not can we afford to do that. To me the question is can we afford not to do that. Because if you look at the overall situation on the global scale, we have a conflict here and now with Russia, but this is not the only hotspot on the globe, if I may say so. And we all know where other hotspots are and how quickly they are developing, etc. And the next time there might be a US that is occupied in another part of the world, and even if they would want to help us, they might not even have the capability or capacity to do so. So I think this is really, the time has really come where Europe has come to a crossroads. Do we want to take responsibility for our own security or not? If we want to do that, then there is only one way to go, and that's invest in Europe.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks, Jan. Very categorical. Excellent. Sylvia.
Yeah, maybe on a few remarks and questions you already asked on the role of the Commission also in that whole how do you say, upwind now on mobilizing investments. I mean, there is no doubt about this, and member states keep repeating it. Defense is a prerogative of the EU member states to organize. There is no doubt about this. And when you said, yes, we heard everything about the creeping power, as you mentioned, or called it the power grab of the Commission, I don't think this is what the Commission wants to do, but we can assist and we can help structure and we can help aggregate demand. We can put in place the mechanisms that can also allow and incentivize and encourage member states to, for example, develop together, procure together, maintain together, which is all a bit the purpose of the programs which we have launched so far, whether this is now in 2021 the EDF with the aim to jointly develop and really also reinforce the European defense industrial and technology base to be capable of producing the capabilities which we need tomorrow. Okay, it's a little bit of a longer perspective, 5 to 10 years, but I think this is vital. If we don't do this type of investments now, when will we ever have that competitive industrial base which we need to supply us with the really modern edge technologies and systems which we so direly need actually already now. So I think that's a bit the role of the Commission, and maybe there is always this misperception of what it wants to do and what it comes into, but I think it's very clear that it's not going to be the Commission who will tell member states what kind of capabilities they need, and they have instruments for that and tools and mechanisms which we, by the way, also using for our programs. So priority setting is done, and we recognize that. But still, I think what we learned maybe from one program such as the EDF, this is not always enough. Sometimes you need also a mechanism which allows you to set priorities within the priorities, because still the priorities which set at European level, they go in manifold and they go in all kinds of directions, and somehow we also think we still need to make a clear priority setting of where we should focus also these funding which is now mobilized, be it at national level, be it at European level. And I think here the Commission can help. That's all, and advise, and that's all it's going to do. And as I said, look into the regulatory framework and make sure that these investments can be done in the best way possible and will have the best effects possible. And then that would be about the role which I also described a little bit earlier. You asked me to talk a bit also about EDF and then what afterwards. If I understand correctly, your question was what happens with how to follow on. The idea has always been that there is a bit of room for 3 things to do in the EDF. And this is on the one side contributing to the development of key capabilities, large capability projects, either already in the background handled, financed and driven by member states themselves, and we contribute to it, or we kickstart large capability development projects which are really necessary, where we have clearly gaps in Europe, I'm just talking about Mailer, which we still don't unfortunately have, but should soon have if all goes well. What we also understand and what we know we need to have also now room in programs like that for a lot more quick fix innovation. I think that's one of the lessons which really also came out of Ukraine. We need to see how we can do that. Maybe less ambitious, maybe cut down a little bit on technical requirements, which member states formulate, and see the famous consumerables, which we will probably need a lot more in the future. And on the third end, what we also see, what needs to be improved is much more faster innovation cycles, for which for the moment a program like EDF is not really prepared. We're trying to improve that, but there will a lot that will have to be done in the future as well, to find mechanisms and define mechanisms for really move innovation, including disruptive technologies, forward a lot quicker than we can do it now. And yes, the idea with the fund has always been, ideally, that's why we ask member states to co-finance a certain capability developments that go then up to the prototyping and final end stage, that they do this by co-financing, by expressing their intent to jointly procure afterwards, leading then also into programs such as, for example, EDIP is doing it by pursuing also joint procurement, this joint procurement philosophy, which we have started with EDIRPA, hoping that this will also, some of the EDF outcomes and prototypes developed there would then also lead into joint procurement activities under programs such as EDIP in the future. Let me stop here.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. Very, very clear, and also thank you for taking the time to link back to the EDF and some of the challenges, and also it's very reassuring to see as well how far you're trying to learn the lessons as well, also from the war in Ukraine. You put quite an emphasis on faster innovation as well, which or quick fixes to the extent possible. Very interesting and important.